This story is a work of fiction, inspired by real events. Names, dates, locations, and identifying details have been changed or dramatized to protect privacy and enhance the narrative. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental or used fictitiously. This content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not aim to glorify crime, promote violence, or pass judgment on real individuals. Viewer discretion is advised. Some scenes may contain mature, disturbing, or triggering content. What you are about to watch could have happened anywhere, to anyone. It's inspired by real events. Whispers of truth buried beneath layers of fiction. We've changed the names, the dates, the locations, but the emotions, the betrayal, the fear, those are real. This story is not meant to accuse, only to reveal, to make you question, who do you really trust? If stories like this keep you thinking, long after they end, hit subscribe, smash like, and drop your theory in the comments. Now watch closely, before the truth disappears again.
Sandra was 56 years old, a woman who carried the quiet weight of experience in every line of her face. To her neighbors, she was kind but private, someone who had weathered storms, yet still held on to a softness that life had not managed to take. Her failed marriage years earlier had left scars, but it also carved out resilience. She lived alone, in a modest house on the outskirts of her Texas town, where evenings often passed in silence, interrupted only by the distant hum of passing cars or the rustle of wind against the windows. Her days were simple: grocery runs, a few phone calls with her sister, the occasional chat with a friend from church. To some, it might have seemed lonely, but Sandra carried herself with quiet dignity. Beneath that solitude was the universal ache of wanting to be wanted, to feel seen again, not as a woman whose best years were behind her, but as someone still capable of being cherished. And then came him, a younger man whose attention brought color back into her world. It was flattering, unexpected, almost intoxicating. Messages that lit up her phone, conversations that made her feel alive, small plans that hinted at a future less lonely. For the first time in years, Sandra found herself laughing again, standing in front of her mirror a little longer, fixing her hair with a spark she thought had long faded. But beneath that warmth, shadows were gathering. Friends whispered their concerns quietly, asking if everything was truly as it seemed. There were little signs, almost invisible at first, moments when he pulled away, vague explanations, a hesitation in his voice. Sandra brushed them aside. After all, hadn't she already endured enough loneliness? Didn't she deserve this one chance at happiness? On the night she stepped out to see him, the air was heavy, the Texas heat clinging to her skin. The streets were quiet, but her heart was not. She believed she was walking toward companionship, toward a man who had promised her something different. Yet every step drew her closer to something darker, something carefully hidden from her view. Because sometimes the greatest surprises are not gifts at all. They are traps waiting in silence. And when Sandra reached his door, what waited inside was not love. It was something else entirely. The question that lingers is not just what happened in that moment, but why. What would drive two people, a man and his wife, to set such a cruel stage? And how could Sandra, after surviving so much already, find herself stepping into the one place where she would never be allowed to leave whole again? Before everything unraveled, Sandra's life moved with the kind of rhythm that drew little attention. Each morning began with the hiss of her old kettle, steam curling above the chipped mug she had used for years. She would sit by the kitchen window, watching the sky shift colors over her modest backyard. The grass grew in uneven patches, sometimes longer than she liked, yet it never looked abandoned. It reflected her life, cared for, but marked by its share of wear. Her days were stitched together by familiar patterns: a trip to the grocery store where the cashier always greeted her by name, Sundays spent in the same pew, listening more than speaking, evenings leafing through worn photo albums that whispered of younger years, family gatherings, a time when her house echoed with voices that were now gone. To anyone looking from the outside, hers was a quiet existence. But inside, silence was not peace. It was longing. The wound of her failed marriage had healed on the surface, but left an ache that never fully faded. She had learned how easily trust could be shattered, how promises could dissolve into absence. Yet beneath the scars was a stubborn hope. Even when she told herself she had grown used to solitude, a deeper truth gnawed at her. She still wanted to feel chosen. So when the younger man entered her world, it felt like light pouring into a dim room. His attention was unexpected, his words disarming, his presence intoxicating. Suddenly, Sandra was laughing again. She lingered at the mirror longer than before, fixing her hair with a spark she thought had burned out years ago. To her, this was not a passing kindness. It was proof that love, real, undeniable love, might still be possible. But hope, fragile as it is, often blinds us to danger. In the middle of her joy, small, doubts flickered, a hesitation in his voice when she asked a question, a pause too long before he answered, gaps in his stories that never quite aligned. Sandra noticed these things, but she turned away from them. After years of loneliness, she was not ready to risk breaking the fragile promise of happiness that had just begun to bloom. And yet, behind the curtain of her trust, another presence already lingered. Unseen, unmentioned, but very real. Sandra did not know it, but her story was no longer hers alone. It was about to entangle with someone else's. Someone watching from the shadows, waiting for the moment to step into the light. Every love story carries with it a silence where doubt waits. For Sandra, that silence began to creep in slowly, almost unnoticed, like a chill in the air before a storm. She had walked through disappointment before. A failed marriage had once left her adrift, and it was this younger man who had breathed warmth back into her life. With him, she felt chosen again, cherished in ways she thought were lost. She clung to that hope, unwilling to let small doubts take root. But shadows moved quietly. He canceled plans without clear reasons. His explanations came too smooth, as though practiced. At times, his eyes smiled differently from his lips, carrying a flicker she could not name. Nights when he vanished into silence stretched longer than they should, leaving her alone with questions she pushed away. Friends teased her gently, asked if she was sure, if perhaps she had rushed into love too quickly. Sandra laughed it off. She told herself that love was never without its complications. Yet when the house fell quiet at night, she felt the whisper of something wrong, tugging at the edges of her peace. It was in the details. A message that came too fast, a conversation that closed too quickly, a tone that felt rehearsed. These were not proofs, only ripples. And yet together they unsettled her heart. On the surface she seemed whole, graceful, steady. But underneath, cracks were beginning to spread. What Sandra didn't see, what no one yet saw, was that these cracks were not mistakes in love. They were the first tremors of a truth that would soon shatter everything. Every life-altering tragedy has a moment when silence becomes unbearable, when all the unspoken words and hidden choices crash into reality. For Sandra, that moment arrived on a night cloaked in stillness, a night that seemed harmless in its quiet beginnings. The neighborhood outside was calm, shadows stretching under the weak glow of street lamps. Inside her home, the air felt different, too heavy, too sharp, as though even the walls were bracing for something they could not stop. Sandra had been balancing her life between two worlds, the fading comfort of her marriage and the secret pull of her young lover, a man full of energy, possibility, and danger. That dangerous balance snapped without warning. The hours that followed left only fragments. A door slammed shut with a force that echoed, a neighbor catching the flicker of lights going on and off, muffled voices rising, then cutting to silence so sudden it felt unnatural. Behind those closed walls, trust collapsed into chaos. Every scar Sandra carried, every risk she had taken for love, twisted back against her in a single instant. What began as desperation transformed into an irreversible act. No one outside the house could see the exact moment when everything changed, but one truth remained undeniable. The breaking point had been reached. By dawn, the city carried on as if nothing had happened. The streets buzzed with routine life, footsteps, laughter, the hum of ordinary mornings. But within Sandra's world, nothing was ordinary anymore. She had crossed the line between endurance and ruin, leaving only shock and questions in her wake. Morning broke without ceremony, its light falling indifferently on a neighborhood that had no idea the night had rewritten one woman's life. For most, it was just another day. But behind Sandra's doors, the air carried the weight of something unspoken, something no sunrise could chase away. Neighbors began to notice subtle shifts. Sandra, once the woman who smiled politely when passing by, now seemed distant, her expression guarded as though she were carrying an invisible burden. Her husband moved differently too, quieter, less certain, as though he was walking through life with the ground unsteady beneath him. And somewhere in the shadows lingered the presence of the young man, the forbidden figure who had entered Sandra's world and would never fully leave it. Whispers began before anyone had proof. A flicker of light in the wrong hour, the sound of voices at night that suddenly went quiet, the tension in Sandra's eyes when someone asked too many questions. The community could sense it. Something had fractured, and though no one could name it, the silence felt louder than words. The shock waves stretched beyond the walls of her home. They seeped into conversations at market stalls, into hushed exchanges in church pews, into the private thoughts of neighbors who wondered what storm could be brewing in a house that once seemed ordinary. But Sandra knew. She felt it in every glance, every uneasy pause, every moment when her world no longer matched the life she had tried to build. The breaking point had passed, and now the aftershocks were everywhere. Reminders that once a life cracks open, it can never quite be sealed again. Secrets have a way of unraveling, not all at once, but thread by fragile thread. For Sandra, the life she had tried to hold together began to slip through her fingers in ways she could no longer control. It started with questions that seemed casual at first. A neighbor asking why the lights stayed on so late. A coworker noting the sudden exhaustion in her eyes. A family friend wondering why her husband appeared restless, his voice lower, his smile thinner. Each question pressed against the cracks, testing their strength. Sandra moved carefully, but no step felt steady anymore. The presence of her young lover lingered like a shadow, impossible to erase. His name was never spoken aloud, yet it lived on in the silence that stretched between her and her husband. Every glance, every pause carried the weight of suspicion. Her husband sensed it, not fully, not clearly, but enough to know that something was broken, enough to feel the sting of betrayal even before proof ever reached his hands. And still, Sandra tried to carry on, her every breath an act of concealment. But truth has its own way of surfacing, in whispers, in subtle gestures, in moments that seem too small to matter, but end up exposing everything. For Sandra, the walls around her secrets were thinning. Each passing day felt like a countdown to the moment when silence would no longer protect her. The unraveling had begun, and with it came the certainty that exposure was no longer a matter of if, but when. Every secret has a limit. For Sandra, that limit had been reached. What began as whispers, hidden glances, and shadows had now grown into a weight so heavy it could no longer be carried. The silence she clung to, the silence she believed would protect her, had turned into the very weapon that destroyed her. Her husband's suspicion was no longer veiled. He stood before her, not shouting, not raging, but carrying the hollow stillness of a man who already knew the answers. His silence spoke more than words. The betrayal was real, and it had cut deeper than anything Sandra could have imagined. The young man in Sandra's life, the one who was supposed to remain in the background, had become a figure impossible to ignore. His presence lingered like a shadow that refused to leave the room. What Sandra thought she could balance, her marriage, her image, her secret, now lay in fragments at her feet. And in that final confrontation, Sandra realized that some truths do not explode into the open. They seep in slowly, filling every corner until there is nowhere left to hide. Her marriage trembled, her reputation faltered, and the life she once believed she controlled slipped through her hands like water. As the silence finally shattered, it left behind no peace, only haunting questions. How long can love survive a lie? How deep does betrayal wound before forgiveness is impossible? And when the truth arrives too late, is there ever a way back? This was not just a confrontation. It was the collapse of a world Sandra could never rebuild. If you've been gripped by Sandra's story, you understand how quickly secrets unravel and how silence always breaks. Subscribe now for more untold stories where hidden lives come to light and every ending leaves questions that linger long after the screen fades to black.